evening, ladies and gentlemen. To those of you in the audience, as well as those of you viewing via live streaming this evening, welcome to the George Bush Presidential Library Center. My name is Fred McClure, and I have the high honor of serving as Chief Executive Officer of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation. Before we go any further, I'd ask that you please find your devices and silence them so that they won't disturb our presentation this evening. Additionally, before we go any further, please allow me to officially introduce the 41st President of the United States and his and our First Lady, George and Barbara Bush. This evening you are attending the third installment of the George Bush Distinguished Authors Series. We have been pleased to have the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush, and also former U.S. Secretary of Defense and President of Texas A&M University, Robert Gates. Tonight we add another distinguished author to that series. Though many of you were able to acquire copies this evening earlier, and sales will continue after our program, tomorrow Random House will publish Destiny and Power, the American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. One of our author's books, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, was a New York Times bestseller and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 2009. His other New York Times bestsellers include Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, and Franklin and Winston, an intimate portrait of an epic friendship. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Executive Board of the Society of American Historians, our author is a regular guest on Morning Joe and also occasionally appears on Meet the Press, Charlie Rose, among other broadcasts. After serving as the managing editor of Newsweek for 8 years, our guest was responsible for all the day-to-day editorial operations of the magazine as editor from 2006 to 2010. He is a former editor of the Washington Monthly and began his career at the Chattanooga Times. He attended the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, earning a degree summa cum laude in English literature, and he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. He received an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree from the Berkeley Divinity School at Yale University in 2005 and also holds 5 other honorary doctorates. He lives in Nashville and Sewanee with his wife and their 3 children. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the third speaker in the George Bush Distinguished Authors Series, my friend, Mr. Jon Meacham. Jon? Yes, sir. I know.
It's all downhill from here. Thank you all for coming to my funeral. A lovely eulogy from Fred.
Do you remember any of it? I've heard about Sewanee, so we'll take it from there. Let's see, Jon, where to start? So tell me, how did a former bigwig at Newsweek gain the trust of the 41st President of the United States?
Thank you all for coming. Fred, I'm going to use a very technical term. I begged. I groveled. I first met the President and Mrs. Bush, had the honor of visiting them in Maine 17 years ago with our mutual friend, Michael Beschloss. And like hundreds of thousands of people before and since, I almost immediately found George Herbert Walker Bush to be a more complicated and interesting figure than he had been portrayed in the press and in the popular mind. I found him to have a quiet, persistent charisma an ineffable and infallible sense of empathy, wanting to make sure that you were comfortable, that he was always thinking about the other guy, not himself. And here was a man who, his brother Jonathan later told me that George had an innate sense of empathy. And so here's this lovely man, this gentleman beyond compare, who also had sought and won ultimate authority in a nuclear age. And so what manner of man was this, who was so gentlemanly, so lovely, who went into the political arena, which does not often reward gentlemanliness and loveliness, and succeeded at the highest levels. And I just knew, I'm sure, at that hour, that there was a great human drama here about the tension, inevitable tension, between service and success in politics.
So begging worked.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Well, now, since last Thursday or Wednesday, I can't remember what day it was, you've been making a lot of news lately.
Well,
one of the things
just to be clear, I didn't say it.
Well, are you done yet?
Well, no, I'm just saying that the 41st president has made a lot of news.
Okay. About some of the things in your book. So are you done yet, or is this going to go on for a little while?
Well, this has been, and I'm going to try not to be too sentimental, but I will speak the truth in the spirit of the subject of the book. Doing this book has been the honor of a lifetime. I believe that the trust that President Bush showed in giving me his vice presidential and presidential diaries, the extraordinary trust that Mrs. Bush showed in allowing me to read and use her diaries. This was done with no conditions. The only condition on the whole project is that I had to clear any quotations, direct quotations from Mrs. Bush's diary with her. And so last year I brought her 90 pages of excerpts. And she was reading them along and got to a certain chronological point, and she said to herself, because she was reading them, she said, "My, I was an awfully opinionated 38-year-old. And it was all I could do to say, well, man, the apple doesn't fall far from the chronological tree. She kept every word on the record. Now, I can tell you, I do this for a living. There is no other presidential family. There are very few other families, period, who are as comfortable in their own skins, who are as confident that they did their best, they put the country first, they believe that history will get this right. And because of that self-confidence, because of that grace, I was able to write a book of which I am enormously proud, not because of me, but because I was able to write about a man whom I admire deeply.
So you've written about Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill. What caused you to begin this journey with George H.W. Bush?
Because of the complexities of his character. He is one of the, as Jim Baker says, he's one of the most deeply competitive human beings who ever drew breath. I asked him once in the morning, interviewing George H.W. Bush, and with him right there, this is a little weird. Fortunately, I think they took the nuclear codes away. But interviewing President Bush, I found that being linear was perhaps not the best strategy. So we would jump from subject to subject. So I would ask him about his mother, and then I asked him about Gorbachev, and it also fell together ultimately. But what was so striking, one morning in Houston, I said, "What drove you?" And he said, "Service." And I said, "Yes, Mr. President, I understand that, but you could have opened a soup kitchen. You could have served, you could have been a point of light in many, many, many different ways besides seeking the presidency of the United States." And he, at that point, ignored me and moved on. That was about 10 a.m. About 5:30 that afternoon, the Bushes had generously asked me over for a cup of tea at 5:30, and he was sitting in the wing chair in the corner of the living room in Houston, and Mrs. Bush and I were talking about other things. And without preamble, without allusion to the question that I had asked 7.5 hours before, he took that big left hand with which he punctuated speaking, and he said, "My motivation has always been goal. It's been to be number one, to be the captain of the team, to be the best in whatever you're in. My mission, my goal is mission, my goal is to be the best." And he put his fist back down and we moved on. And I realized then that he was answering the question from the morning, and that he did see his life in terms of missions. And his sister, Nancy, told me that the thing she always thought of first about George was that he was simply the star of the family and was so remarkably good at everything he did. And my own view, my own biographical view of this is that I think President Bush had one of the world's greatest mothers, one of the world's most distinguished fathers, and I think there was and I've talked about this with him and with all of his siblings, and so they signed off on this basically. I think that there was an ethos in Greenwich and Kennebunkport of unconditional love, unquestionably unconditional love. But he had two parents who were good at almost everything they did. Mrs. Bush, Dorothy Walker Bush, once broke her wrist in the middle of a tennis match, but finished it and won. Jonathan Bush also told me, Mother was very gracious in defeat, but of course she never lost. Which makes it easier in many ways. We all know the stories about the president coming home and saying, "I hit a home run," and she'd say, "Well, George, how did the team do? Don't be a braggadocio." The president has an ambivalent relationship with the first-person pronoun. We all know that. But that's because of his mother. What I think happened in his childhood and youth was that he always knew he was loved unconditionally. But because the Bushes kept score fairly but scrupulously, because they were a competitive clan, I remember an old Texas political aide told me that you never wanted to play ping pong with a Bush because you would come out bruised. I think that those who achieved rose in the respect and esteem of that family. So you were loved, but achievement meant that there was also respect. And one of the words the president uses about his grandfathers, about Senator Bush, his father, is respected. About Brent Scowcroft, one of the highest compliments in my years of interviewing President Bush, the highest accolade I've heard him use for someone is that he's respected. And I think that came from a childhood where sports, athletics were a big part of that. School was too, obviously. But my sense is that his mother was arguably the most important woman in his life until a certain Christmas dance in 1941.
Let's talk about the presidency a little bit as a whole. If you were to compare President Bush to his predecessors and his successors, maybe we better exclude one guy in that successor thing.
Yeah. Clinton would be upset. Yeah.
He might be, yes. Yeah. Was there an era with which the president could most readily be placed?
I think that George Herbert Walker Bush has more in common culturally and temperamentally and politically with Dwight Eisenhower and politically, culturally and temperamentally with President Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt. And I would also argue that he actually has a great deal in common with the Founding Fathers as someone for whom public service was an ambient extension of himself. It was an expected part of his life. He was a great adherent and exponent of the gospel declaration that to whom much is given, much is expected. And he was born with almost everything. a life of privilege which he appreciated throughout his life, and yet he knew that because he'd been given so much, he had to serve. And he started with Bennett McNichol, who was a slightly overweight young classmate at Greenwich Country Day School. They were running an obstacle race. When Bushes ran obstacle races, they tended to win. But Bennett McNichol got stuck in a barrel. And so Pappy Bush stopped, sacrificed his place in the race to pull Bennett McNichol through that barrel and finish the race with him. That's the kind of man who he was and is today. Service mattered. The other guy mattered. And that's something that I believe belongs to an older and I would argue tragically fading sense of public service.
You had 9 years of interviews, including as George and Barbara Bush, an open door to family members and friends, and on top of that, full access to those diaries of George and Barbara Bush. I think Mrs. Bush is dated back to 1948. That had to be fascinating. What was that like?
It's amazing. I mean, let's start with the presidential diary. This is as close as anyone except one other person in this room is ever going to get to being president of the United States. Listening to the diaries, reading the transcripts, you find yourself experiencing the vicissitudes of power in a way that I've never seen, partly because they're audio diaries. He dictated into a tape recorder. Early in the morning, late at night, on Marine One, on Air Force One, at Camp David. You can hear the helicopter blades, you can hear the engines of Air Force One. And because they're not written, because he's talking, it's more emotional. There's a greater emotion, there's a greater sense of urgency. And what I find so fascinating about them is they are highly confessional in the sense of he was not always thrilled with, say, the Democratic Congress. He was not always thrilled with the press. Well, he was never thrilled with the press.
I was going to say, he didn't hide that from some folks.
No. If only the Legislative Affairs Office had been a little bit, everything's what we do. That's right. Did I tell you what he said? No.
No.
Goddamn McClure.
Yes,
no. We covered that up.
We did.
But here's my theory about this. If you only knew George Bush through these diaries, you would think, here's a guy who complained a little bit about what was going on. Here's the thing. This is the only place he complained about the burdens of the office. And it's not even really complaining, it's just describing. Because, as he said to me, nobody ever wants to hear a president say, "Oh, woe is me." You're just damn lucky to be there. And so what would happen in these diaries is, I believe, and this is a word that he does not particularly like, but I believe there was a therapeutic element where he could talk to himself and to history about what George Mitchell had just done, what the troop, what the planning was going to be in terms of trying to take on Iraq and free Kuwait, the internecine diplomacy with Gorbachev. And if he was having a bad day, what he would always do, I try to apply this to my own life and fail miserably. At the end of a particularly contentious day, he would then try to talk himself back into the game. So he would say, all this is true, but I just got to get in there tomorrow, always look ahead, always move ahead. And I think this is another thing that I find to be one of the core truths biographically about the president, is the code, the fundamental Bush code, that you always look ahead. And you always try to live every moment to the fullest. And if I can give you two examples about where I think this came from. One is On his 18th birthday, on June 12th, 1942, he graduates from Andover. He goes to Boston. He's sworn in as a naval enlistee. By Saturday, September 2nd, 1944, in an operation codenamed Baker, he is over Chichijima. His plane is hit. He manages to finish the mission. He hits the tower he's supposed to hit. He banks back out to sea. He does everything he's supposed to do, but the two crewmen, Ted White and Dale Delaney, died. Tragically, the president spent 4 hours in a life raft bouncing around, hoping that a submarine on what was called lifeguard duty would find him. And I asked him on several occasions about those men who died that day. And he said that he thought about them every day. He has thought about them every day since 1944. And I said, well, what do you think about? And he says, well, I wonder two things. Did I do enough? And why was I spared? The answer to the first is yes. He did everything he could do. The answer to the second, I think, is the evidence of his life since then is the answer to why he was spared. I think that he believed at that moment that he had been given a precious gift of life that had been denied to others, and that he felt the same kind of obligation to serve that had begun to take shape in his life in his childhood. That's one thing. And the other is, I believe, that the loss of Robin in 1953 to leukemia imbued the president with a sense that, as he told me, life is fragile and precious, and that it can be taken away at any point. And so every moment has to be treated as a gift and a charge. And I believe that he went into the 1950s, into the politics of the 60s, shaped by these two experiences of life and death, knowing that he had been spared. He had been taught in the most brutal possible way, with the loss of their child, that life was fragile and unpredictable. And I believe that the world and all of us are better off, ultimately, because George Herbert Walker Bush believed that life was fragile and unpredictable, and he reacted to that by becoming a steadying and sure-handed force in the affairs of the world.
As many of us know, George Bush was and remains a rather prolific letter writer, even if it was just a note card. Is there a letter that sticks out in your mind that sheds some insight on George Bush, the man?
I do. He is the St. Paul of the Republican Party. You're right. The epistle from St. George. It's one of the few letters to survive during the war between President Bush and Barbara Bush. So if you'll indulge me for a moment. Mrs. Bush was in her first semester at Smith. And this is the voice of George Herbert Walker Bush at the age of 19 years old. I love you, precious, with all my heart, and to know that you love me means my life. How often I have thought about the immeasurable joy that will be ours someday. How lucky our children will be to have a mother like you. As the days go by and the time of our departure for war draws nearer, for a long time I had anxiously looked forward to the day when we would go aboard and set to sea. It seemed that obtaining that goal would be all I could desire for some time. But, Bar, you have changed all that. I cannot say that I do not want to go, for that would be a lie. We have been working for a long time with a single purpose in mind, to be so equipped that we could meet and defeat our enemy. I do want to go because it is my part. Bar, you have made my life full of everything I could ever dream of. My complete happiness should be a token of my love for you. Good night, my beautiful. Every time I say beautiful, you about kill me, but you'll have to accept it. That was 1943.
They kind of kept it up.
They have kept it up.
Early on in your book, you write at length about family influence on George Bush, particularly during his formative years. Would you share 2 or 3 character traits that developed during this time that would inform President Bush's decisions later in life?
Sure. I think it's safe to say that George H.W. Bush is not a solitary figure, not a loner. His gregariousness, his empathy, the capacity to think about the other guy, which loved team sports, told me once he even loved Glee Club. I don't know if anyone else loved him in the Glee Club, but he told me that. He loved any activity as a young man where he was with other people. And so it is a bit of God's providence that he became a congressman, a diplomat, a party chairman, a vice president, a president. I think that his gregariousness as a young boy played itself out with his remarkable capacity, as he once put it, when he became president, even if he didn't have anything to really say to some emir, he would call him up and say, "Hey, emir, how's the weather in the desert out there?" On the grounds that he might someday need that emir. And after the 2nd of August, 1990, he found out he did need them.
Throughout the book, and you mentioned earlier, the president's mother, Dorothy Walker Bush, remained a strong influence in his life. And during his service in the war, he wrote his mother explaining his views of girls and dating. Now, what went through your mind as you reflected upon George Bush's candor on his views on those subjects?
Biographers have to take lives in full, Fred.
Okay, all right.
I think what must have happened is Mrs. Bush Dorothy Walker Bush seems to have caught Nancy Bush kissing a boy. And this caused a great family crisis. And so her son, Lieutenant Junior Grade George Herbert Walker Bush, was brought in because of the worry that Nancy was about to lose her soul. And so President Bush wrote a letter in which he said that he didn't want to blow the whistle on anybody, but there were some boys, even some, he said, who had gone to Yale, who might have once or twice kissed a girl. And he said he would not worry about it, and then signed it Love, Pop, PhD, Sexology.
I guess that was candor.
It was a more innocent era, my friend.
It was.
And rightly.
Yes. Now, as readers get the chance to dive into the book, and without telling us too much, would you share 2 or 3 things that you think will surprise the reader?
I think what surprised me the most was George Bush, again, and coming at him before I knew him very well, struck me as the classic button-down, WASP patrician public servant. Very serious. He is an emotional casserole, this man. He is as wonderfully emotional. He is tactile. He has incredible emotional intelligence. His friends will tell you that he's a little like Radar O'Reilly in MASH. You know, if something's going wrong with you, he just intuits it and wants to help. In the White House, when an aide or a cabinet member would be kicked around in the paper, the phone would ring early in the morning, and it would be the President of the United States calling to say, "Hey, don't worry about it, keep your chin up."
Yeah. Go ahead.
You got a few of those wake-up calls. That's right. So I think that his emotionalism surprised me. The letdown that the president felt after the victory in the Gulf surprised me. He tells his diary that though he's immensely proud of the projection of American power, immensely proud of the performance of the troops, that there was no battleship Missouri surrender. He worried about what kind of victory was it when the enemy remained in power. But he also knew that he had defined a mission where there wasn't going to be a battleship Missouri. But that didn't mean that he didn't want it at some level. And I have always seen, like most Americans, had always seen the first Gulf War as this very surgical, brilliantly diplomatic, powerful military performance. But here, in the privacy of his tape recorder, the President of the United States is a little down that it wasn't, he didn't get to take the enemy fully out.
Let's go there a little bit. There was a lot of stuff going on then. Not only did we have the naked aggression of Saddam Hussein in terms of Kuwait, but we were also in the middle of serious budget negotiations with the Congress of the United States, the potential for a government shutdown. In fact, a government shutdown for a few days. And in his diary, he wrote, "I like wrestling with the foreign policy agenda. I don't like the negotiations on the budget." Talk to us about the president's temperament at this time.
Well, there were two things. One, I think he gets a slight bum rap on the front end of this, so before we get right to that. When the Bushes first moved into the White House, one of the things that I think shaped the president's view of the presidency was their experience in Congress from 67 to 71. Because George H.W. Bush goes to Congress as a Republican from the 7th District of Houston at a time when there's a Texas president, but from the other party. But the Washington he went to was one in which you called them as you saw them. And so I went back and looked at the voting records from that era. Congressman George Bush voted with Lyndon Johnson 53% of the time. Can you imagine today a Republican voting 53% of the time with a Democratic president? So, but then you might say, well, Nixon came in that second 2 years, so what was that number? It skyrocketed. Congressman George Bush of the 7th District of Houston voted with Richard Nixon 55% of the time. He called them as he saw them. And he did it in an atmosphere where he was in the House gym with Lud Ashley and Sonny Montgomery and Rosti, and the Democrats and Republicans knew each other. They trusted each other. They weren't going to I'm not talking about a bipartisan Valhalla. I don't think this was like the Admiral and Mary Poppins was over next door with, this magical Hogwarts of bipartisanship. I don't mean that. But the reality is that personal relationships mattered more. And so I think that ambient experience, that experience in the House, is much more important than people have focused on before. I think people focus on the UN and the Republican National Committee and China and the CIA, all incredibly important. This is the reason there are a lot of pages here is there are a lot of archaeological levels to go through here. But I think those years in Congress meant an enormous amount and shaped his view of the presidency. So, Friday, January 20th, 1989, the Bushes move into the White House. The president has bought a one-step camera, which was for the young people in the audience, that was the iPhone camera of 1989, and starts inviting every member of Congress down to the residence, and he would take a picture of them on the Lincoln bed, on the argument that if a congressman has a picture taken by the President of the United States, you're probably going to keep it, right? And and so apparently President Bush says to Mrs. Bush at one point, this is really going to help us with the budget. And Mrs. Bush says, well, Lyndon Johnson did this too, and look what happened to him. And President Bush in his diary said, I like to think that had something to do with Vietnam as well. So you get a few marital moments along the way. But for the first 2 years of his presidency, he was very much engaged domestically. You would give him, there are all these papers right over there, You would give him long call sheets. Fred was running the Legislative Affairs Office, and he would call the congressman. He would make the notes. If you asked him to call, he would do it. President Bush tried to do with the Congress what he did more successfully with foreign leaders. It was more successful not because George Bush's heart was not in his domestic policy, because it was, because he's a man of duty, and he knew that that was a key part of his oath, but because it was systemically different. If you call a foreign leader, you are calling with a different level of power and authority. If you're calling a subcommittee chairman, you have an enormously complex set of, you can't just call Congress and say, do this, and make a deal as quickly, build an alliance as quickly as you can do it with a foreign leader. So I think that, and after the war, when people said, oh, you've got to take your approval rating out and do domestic storm. Remember that always calls for domestic storm. And in the diary, the president says, all right, we'll try this one on for size. Let's say you had Ted Kennedy as Secretary of State and Dick Gephardt as Secretary of Defense. How successful a domestic storm would that be? All of that said, I think the domestic record is one of the most underrated in modern American history. He signed the most sweeping civil rights legislation in a generation. This building is equipped for disabled Americans to move around it with the freedom of anyone else. Every building in America has been transformed by this man's signature with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was rooted in his sense of fair play. And at a critical moment, it helped pass because he had invited Tom Harkin down for martinis. Barbara was out of town. It was a Friday night. He had this stag cocktail party, and it was Jack Kemp. I don't know how y'all had any time to talk about anything because Kemp would be talking. But the martinis were mixed, and Harkin was a pilot, so they were talking about flying. And they go to the elevator, and Harkin, I think perhaps with a little bit of the courage of Jen, said, you know, Mr. President, we're having a hard time with this ADA thing. And President Bush turns to Boyden Gray and says, get this done. These moments don't happen enough. But politics is personal. We are all here because of quirks and habits of the people who lead us. And George H.W. Bush brought that personal diplomacy as best he could to domestic legislation, and he brought it to foreign policy. And if you had told anyone in 1980 that by Christmas Day, 1992, the Soviet Union would no longer exist and not a shot had been fired, you would have lost your bet. And yet that happened, and I think it was a joint project of Ronald Reagan and George Bush. I frankly think that Ronald Reagan did some things that George Bush could not have done, particularly rhetorically. And I know there are things in terms of actually landing the plane and bringing down the wall and managing the breakup of the Soviet Union that George Bush did that President Reagan could not. As Americans, the world, we are better off because those two men were in office when the crisis of our time came.
So why didn't the president make the decision to, go further after Saddam when the aggression would not stand?
Well, there were 35 nations in that coalition. It would have splintered apart instantly. We would have been an occupying power in an Arab land. The Brits probably would have peeled off. I think Jon Meacham made that clear. So suddenly you would have had a unilateral American power trying to effect regime change after he had given his word that he was not seeking regime change. He was seeking to restore what was really Franklin Roosevelt's vision of a post-World War II world in which boundaries mattered. It was the Gulf War is the first great crisis of the post-Cold War era. That's an important way to think of it. And because of Jim Baker and because of George Bush, they managed to keep the Soviets pretty much in line. It was not easy. It looks easier in retrospect. But Iraq had long been a client state of the Soviets, and Gorbachev was, under the last hour, was always calling in with some diplomatic initiative or another. There's one moment in the diary where, at the very end, when they're thinking about diplomacy, there's talk that President Bush might meet with Saddam somewhere, which was news to me in the diary. And then there was talk that he would send Jim Baker to Baghdad. And when I called Secretary Baker to check that, he said, yeah, I want to know what second prize was. I might not have made it out of there.
There was a later involvement with Saddam Hussein, and
I read about that.
And did you gain anything in your research about this president's attitude about?
Yes, I did. And this is one of the things that I find fascinating about the difference between journalism and commentary and history. There is a persistent belief in what President Bush would call the common wisdom that he did not support President Bush 43's actions against Iraq. Many people believe that. The problem is it flies in the face of the actual historical record. And as John Adams once said, facts are stubborn things. In late 2002, at Camp David, President Bush 43 briefed his father. His father said, I understand what you're doing. If the man won't comply with the UN resolutions, you have to do what you have to do. He gave a speech in Houston making the same point. And on the day Operation Iraqi Freedom began in 2003, he wrote his son a note, which I'd like to read one little part of. This is the day that George W. Bush had issued the orders to go to war in 2003. George W. Bush says, I know I have taken the right action and do pray few will lose life. Iraq will be free. The world will be safer. I know what you went through. Love, George. President Bush 41 wrote back and faxed the letter. Dear George, your handwritten note just received touched my heart. You are doing the right thing. Read that again. You are doing the right thing. Your decision just made is the toughest decision you've had to make up until now, but you made it with strength and with compassion. It is right to worry about the loss of innocent life, be it Iraqi or American, but you have done that which you had to do. Maybe it helps a tiny bit as you face the toughest bunch of problems any president since Lincoln has faced. You carry the burden with strength and grace. Remember Robin's words, I love you more than tongue can tell. Well, I do. Devotedly, Dad. And my voice here quickly. Reading his father's words aloud a decade later, George W. Bush choked up with emotion. Tears came to his eyes as he relived briefly a moment when a father's love and a predecessor's approval came in a single note to offer reassurance in a troubled hour.
Pretty cool. Let's have some questions from the audience. Microphones are at the end of the aisles. Lights are up. We can see who you are. Please come forward, identify yourself, and you have an opportunity to have a chat with John like the one that I've been enjoying.
Good evening.
Hi.
My name's Mary Bailey, and when you were describing the Bushes and the people you see now, and especially comparing back to the Bushes that you thought you knew before you actually met them, I'd have to say that I wish I could have said the same thing, but your words are much better. But it occurs to me that as you're writing this book then and you're starting the project, what sort of insights did you have, or how did you pull all this together so that you could unfold the man that really is compared to maybe what you had started out thinking?
It's a marvelous question. I mean, It's the whole biographical enterprise. You attempt to paint a portrait based on what you can see. And that's documents, that's diaries, that's the people themselves. And you try to, forgive me, I'm from Tennessee, so we quote William Faulkner, even though he was from Mississippi. It's an act of grace because, let's be honest, Mississippi. I'm married to a Mississippian, so I use that only in large crowds. But Faulkner said in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1949, I think, that the goal of the artist or of the poet, and I would argue of the historian, is to take out of the human experience elements in order to create something else that did not exist before. And that's a grand way of saying that's what I'm after. But I write biography not because I believe these men are perfect, but because despite their imperfections, they still manage to bend history in the direction of good. And I believe we learn more from the past, not if we look up adoringly or down condescendingly, but if we try to look them in the eye. And when you look them in the eye, you can see that they're human beings struggling through what the great Victorian novelist George Eliot called the dim lights and tangled circumstance of the world. And what I found with this man was someone who always put the country first, above his political interest, as he tried to lead the rest of us through those dim lights and tangled circumstance.
Good evening. My name is Brian Blake, and I appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you.
You may have touched a little bit on at the end of your answer, but you talk about President Bush's voting record in the 60s and 70s, and then kind of allude to the fact that we lack that cooperation today. And could you talk a little bit more about President Bush's drive to win and how he put that aside in doing what was right for his constituents and the country as a whole?
Sure, it's a great question. Because to serve, you have to succeed. And I remember the president telling me, the great example of this is civil rights and what happened between 1964 and 1968. So when President Bush, when George H.W. Bush decides to run for the Senate in 1964, he's a Goldwater Republican. Pete O'Donnell came down from Dallas. Bob Stewart, a banker, had said, there's this bright young guy, you should come meet him. His dad was in the Senate in Connecticut. And O'Donnell came down and said, would you be interested in running for the Senate? He didn't have to push very hard. And so George Bush runs in that tumultuous year. He opposes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As did many Republicans at that time. And I asked him how he could do that many, many years later. And he said, well, politics is not a pure undertaking. Not if you want to win, it's not. There are some positions that you have to ingest badly in order to be in the arena. But cut to 1968, when he had won and amassed power as a member of Congress. What does he do in April of 1968? He votes for open housing in a district that was against open housing. And he goes to Memorial High School and faces an enormous, I don't want to say mob, but an enormous audience of angry constituents who are basically saying, we didn't send you up there to do this. And he stood there and he took it and he took it and he took it. And he describes in a diary getting on an airplane to go back to Washington after this horrible meeting at the high school. And a woman's coming right at him. And politicians get to know the look on somebody's face, when you're about to get it. And so he's bracing himself. And she says, I just want you to know I'm a Democrat, but you'll always have my vote. He did this on civil rights, so he did something in his drive to win that, in retrospect, I don't think he is as proud of as he wishes otherwise had been. But when he had power, he made a difference. 1988 was not the kindest and gentlest of presidential campaigns. But what does he do once he becomes president? He's inviting those members of Congress down to take pictures of them. He's building an attempt, a capital culture, to discern the consensus of the country in order to pass significant legislation, manage the end of the Cold War, defend a new world order in where small countries are safer from large countries. You know, when he had power, he did the right thing. He said, read my lips, no new taxes. I asked him once, what's your largest regret in life? Without hesitating, he said in his best Dana Carvey voice, shouldn't have said, read my lips. Sometimes I couldn't tell if it was Bush doing Carvey or Carvey doing this is one thing. As a biographer of George Herbert Walker Bush, here's the kind of afternoon you can have. I was at our house in Sewanee, fact-checking away this summer, and in the course of 1 hour, I spoke to 3 people, checking the last details. Dick Cheney, Henry Kissinger, and Dana Carvey in character. So, I'm still not, it may have been you, sir, I don't know. But Carvey's best line is that the way to do it, George Bush, is to take Mr. Rogers with an overlay of John Wayne. Unleash orgy of death. Get this. This is key. It wouldn't be prudent for me to do this anymore because Mrs. Bush is going to get mad. What was the question? Thanks, Brian.
Sir, I'm Brian Groves. I'm a PhD candidate at Duke as well as a Army officer active duty. Thanks so much for all your insights today.
Thank you for your service.
Great.
Thank you for your service.
You've spoken some about President Bush's decision to end the Gulf War when he did, and you listed a number of factors. It's one of my case studies for my dissertation. I'm interested in the role that the shadow of Vietnam had. I don't remember you mentioning that among the various factors, and I'm interested in the role that Vietnam had in the decision-making process, as well as if Lebanon had had any impact on that decision, and how those factors, along with the ones you've already mentioned, were able to overcome any sunk cost opportunities from having already deployed 500,000 troops to the region as being an impetus to, hey, let's go to Baghdad. We've already paid a lot of the costs. We have some of the costs paid for by the coalition.
Right. No, it's a great question. Briefly, in the President's diary and in his public statements about the wars, as you know, there are 2 recurring historical analogies: the Second World War and the possibly analogous situation that if you don't stop a dictator on the front end, you pay a much steeper price on the back end. So the President, in his first address to the country in the Oval Office, from the Oval Office on the crisis, personally inserted an allusion to the Rhineland so that it would speak to his generation and the Hitler analogy. There's a wonderful side note there. He held out his left hand to see if it were shaking right before you gave the speech, and he was pleased to see that there was no tremor. He was totally calm in this crisis. And in many ways, his whole life had been but preparation for this hour and for this trial, which is a phrase of Churchill's. So World War II shaped his thinking, his own combat experience, because he knew what happened to young men like you who sign up and you go and you put yourself in harm's way to protect the rest of us. He understood that this was not a clinical exercise. It cost blood. He lost his friends. He lost his roommate, the 2 men with him. He remembered seeing a sailor being cut in half on a carrier, and only being able to recover when a tough chief petty officer said, all right, we just got to clean this up and move on. He knows that war is unpredictable. But the Vietnam analogy is hugely important because there was an enduring crisis of confidence in the country that we could not project force around the world and exert our will in the way that we once had. And Vietnam was the central example of that. The phrase Vietnam syndrome was very much in the air then. And so one of the reasons for what's credited to General Powell also involved Cap Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense under President Reagan, of the Powell Doctrine of define your objectives cleanly, apply overwhelming force, and then get out, was in direct response to our conduct of the Vietnam War. And so I think there's an excellent dissertation to be done on the use of historical analogies in the first Gulf War. And you put your finger on almost all of them, including Lebanon, which felt like a quagmire. President Bush, as vice president, went over right after the Marine barracks bombing, and which our Marines came out. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Would it be possible to make a comparison between President Bush and some of the other historical persons you have written about, such as Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt,
Right.
or perhaps Thomas Jefferson?
I was hoping you asked about Andrew Jackson because I want Fred to set up a paintball dueling station outside so that we might get some younger folk. We'll talk about it. Okay. Absolutely. I mean, let's start with Thomas Jefferson. My view of Thomas Jefferson is that he should be chiefly seen not as a philosopher, which is how he wanted to be seen, and more as a politician, as someone committed to the art of the possible, as someone committed to making the political manifestation of the European Enlightenment, which was the United States of America. All men are created equal was a sentence written to begin a government, but it was part of a broader experiment. But Jefferson, year in and year out, for 40 years, which is about almost exactly the span of President Bush's active political career, was seeking office, holding office. If he didn't have office, he wanted it. If he had it, sometimes he didn't want it on a bad day. I think a lot of that is applicable to President Bush. FDR, I think, is a very useful analogy in that he came from a part of the world, a part of American society, where service was expected of you. You did not have to suffer impoverishment or pain in order to understand the problems of the impoverished or the pained. President Bush went back to his elementary school some years after he retired and was trying to talk about what it was like to come from a background of means. And he alluded to the fact that for some reason rich Democrats are always hailed as champions of the people. Roosevelt's, Harriman's. Rich Republicans are always hailed as champions of the rich, and that there was a double standard at work there. And I think there's a lot to that. In terms of Churchill, I think Churchill spent his life learning the ropes of government. Winston Churchill was elected to Parliament when Queen Victoria was on the throne in 1901. He died in 1965, 4 years before we put a man on the moon. He was 65 years old when he became Prime Minister. He served more than 40 years. He had ups and downs, defeats. He spent time in the wilderness. And yet he was always driven by this vision of himself as someone in whose hands the country could safely place its fate. And I believe that though he wouldn't admit it directly, I think that George Bush was driven by a sense of destiny, partly because people around him saw that it was possible for him to possibly become president long before it was probable. It started with his father-in-law. Now, I have a father-in-law who has never predicted that I will one day be president.
Or successful.
Or successful.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. Thanks, Fred. You're welcome. Thank you, man. This comes out Mississippi crack. When the Bushes were at Yale, Marvin Pierce wrote a letter saying it would not at all surprise him to see his son-in-law, George Bush, become president. In the 1950s, Prescott Bush introduced his son to the French ambassador in Washington, saying, "This is my son George. He's going to be president of the United States one day." Nancy Bush Ellis, his sister, said of the shoot-down over Chichijima, he was meant to be saved. This is not to say it was inevitable or it was given to him. No man ever worked harder to become president of the United States than George Herbert Walker Bush. He used to wear himself out on the campaign trail that once during the 1980 campaign he shook the hand of a department store dummy. It was a little, it showed Lyndon Johnson would have got the guy registered. So I see a lot of similarities, and mostly what I see is honestly an imperfect man trying to do the best he can. He didn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and he left the world better off than it was when he found it. And that's the best thing you can say about any of us, I think.
Thank you. Quick, two more, and then we're going to have to be done.
Sir, good evening. My name is Joshua Causey. I'm a student at the Bush School. For a moment, could you please talk about George Bush's decision to, unlike critics that might have said he should have, not criticize the Soviet Union at the fall of the wall? I mean, looking back retrospectively, by many probably a great decision, but how do you think his state of mind was at that time and how he felt about it?
Well, the good thing about this diary is that he told us. He believed, and this, remember, his mother nicknamed him Have-Half when he was a child, because if he had a treat or a dessert, he would cut it in half and give it to the other person. This goes back to what Johnny Bush said about innate empathy. He was able, uniquely among politicians, I think, he was able to put himself in the shoes of the other guy. And so as the wall begins to come down, 6th, 7th, 8th of November 1989, there's been intelligence on it. They weren't totally stunned, but it was still moving far more rapidly than they expected. He had dinner the Sunday night before it all happened with Richard Nixon, of all people, who had come down, and it was the first time Nixon had been back in the residence since he'd resigned. And it was funny, President Bush noted that he had no real feeling for the staff, that he didn't connect with people in the way that the Bushes did and others did. So the wall begins to come down. Brent Scowcroft brings in the report. They adjourn to the little study off the Oval Office where the president did such great work. He kept a map above his desk, a specially made desk where a Selectric typewriter. For the students, we'll explain what that is later. It's like a Model A, I realize, to you all, used in Thermopylae. But he had a map over the desk with the changing boundaries of the world as the world was changing during the administration. And they watched it on CNN back in that little office. And President Bush was instantly able to put himself in Gorbachev's shoes. They knew that there were still hardliners in the Soviet Union who might well try to take advantage of this to crack down. And I'll ask you a question as a Bush School student. What would have been the international overhang of a democratic movement in a fairly confined space in November of '89? What had happened 4 months before? Tiananmen Square. So in China, a regime had opened fire and sent in the tanks to stop democratic unrest. George Bush knew that. The East German secret chief of police, had been running a documentary praising the Chinese regime's brilliance in putting down the unrest in that period. And so the president, and as we know, the president has a way with metaphors. He decided that he did not want to stick it in Gorbachev's ear. I think he meant eye, but either would be painful. So we didn't want to stick it in his ear. And Gorbachev, and then you cut to, and then you had you had Dick Gephardt and George Mitchell saying, the president does not understand the poetry and significance of this moment. Jesus God. I mean, no one understood the fall of the Berlin Wall better than a man who had been shot down out of the sky the last time a war of ideologies had led to a hot war, and who had been raised and formed in the Cold War, who had served as ambassador to the United Nations, director of the CIA, had been in China, had been vice president of the United States for 8 tumultuous Cold War years. The idea that George Bush didn't understand the poetry of the occasion is madness. The point is, you can't always govern in poetry. You govern in prose because people's lives are at stake. If he had gone out and given a triumphalist speech, he could have aggravated the hardliners, complicated Gorbachev's life, possibly led to violence and bloodshed. So he chose to be restrained because, as he saw it, if it were happening to him, that's what he would want the other guy to do. It was the first significant step in ending the Cold War without a shot being fired. And when Gorbachev and the president then met at Malta at the C6 summit later, and at one moderately contentious moment, President Bush says, well, I hope you've noticed we did not dance on the wall. And Gorbachev said, yes, we have noticed that and we appreciated that. I'm convinced that the relationship they were able to create, which happened in November of '89, in December of '89 at Malta, in May of 1990 at the Washington Summit, an underappreciated moment where there were a lot of economic deals going. There was Lithuania. The president came up with a brilliant diplomatic solution to deal with some of the republics, linking it to economic aid for Gorbachev. And it was all kept secret because it had to be for the good of the country. He knew what it meant when the wall came down. But what he did is he acted like a statesman, not a campaigner.
My name is Randy Kluver. I'm a faculty member at Texas A&M, and I agree with you. It's very weird to ask you about George Bush's thinking right when he's right there.
Right.
So you've mentioned Tiananmen Square. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the relationships that President Bush had formed while he was in China and how that moderated his response to the events in Tiananmen Square.
It's a great question, and I defer to my good friend, colleague Jeff Engel at SMU, who edited the President's China Diary, which I highly recommend. And Jeff is hard at work on a diplomatic history of the Bush years. In an interview in 2005, I think, with President Bush, the President told Jeff that because he had been in China, he knew that Deng Xiaoping was a good bet for a reformed future, despite the passions and emotions and violence of the moment. I talked to Henry Kissinger at some length about this, and he said because Bush had been there, he knew that Deng was ultimately a reformer. And so without that personal experience, President Bush might very well have had a different reaction to being restrained at the time of Tiananmen.
Thanks, Randy. We talked about how you began the book, and after all of the rich sources, the research, the rich source material, including the subject himself,
Yep.
Tell us about the conclusion.
I'm just going to inflict 2 paragraphs on you. They're short. But this says as well as I can what I found as this journey concluded. A formidable physical presence, 6'2", handsome, dominant in person, he spoke with his strong, big hands, waving dismissively to deflect unwelcome subjects or to suggest that someone was, as he would put it, way out there, beyond the mainstream, beyond reason, beyond Bush. Television conveyed his lankiness, but not his athleticism and his grace. He was the kind of man other men noted, and the kind women were often surprised to find attractive. He was a terrific flirt, charming women and men alike with a perpetual cheerfulness. Bush was a master of what Franklin Roosevelt thought of as the science of human relationships, and his capacity to charm, with a handwritten note, a phone call, a quick email, a wink, a thumbs up, was crucial to his success in public life. He did lack the glamour of a John Kennedy or the stage presence of a Ronald Reagan. His was a quiet but persistent charisma, an ability to make others love him without, perhaps, their quite knowing why. He was driven less by ideas about politics than by an ideal of service and an ambition to win. In the White House, he peacefully managed the end of the communist threat, secured the heart of Europe, and struggled to bring order to the chaos of the Middle East. Before his White House years, a nuclear Armageddon between America and the Soviet Union was always a possibility. Afterward, it was unthinkable. President and statesman, politician and father, he was both a maker and a mirror of the story of American power, from the Allied victory against Germany and Japan to the beginnings of the war on Islamic terror. On the home front, his 1990 budget agreement put controls on spending and created the conditions for the elimination of the federal budget deficit under Bill Clinton. He negotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and passed historic clean air legislation. He was the child of one generation's ruling class, the head of another's, and the father of yet a third. His life is a saga that ranges from the Gilded Age of railroad barons to the birth of big oil, from Greenwich and Midland to Washington, New York, Baghdad, and Beijing. His political life was shaped by two of the great forces in American life after World War II, the global responsibilities of a vital atomic power in foreign affairs, and the rise of the right wing of the Republican Party in domestic politics. Americans unhappy with the reflexively polarized politics of the first decades of the 21st century will find the presidency of George H.W. Bush refreshing, even quaint. He embraced compromise as a necessary element of public life, engaged his political foes in the passage of important legislation, and was willing to break with the base of his own party in order to do what he thought was right, whatever the price. Quaint, yes, but it happened in America only a quarter of a century ago. A final image. At Walker's Point, a hurricane is coming in several years ago, and he's on the stony shoreline, and they're boarding up the house, but no one can find him. As the storm came in, the power was out, and there were 50-mile-per-hour winds. The rain had stopped just briefly when Jean Becker, the 41st President's Chief of Staff, realized she did not know where Bush was. She went from room to room in the house. No Bush. Finally, she peeked out the door and saw the former President of the United States on a scooter on the putting green, looking out at the stormy sea. There he sat on the stony shoreline, near the cottage path where he had learned to walk and the rocks where he had played as a child. This was the place he had proposed marriage and raised his children and grandchildren and now great-grandchildren. This was the place he had received heads of state. This was the place he had contemplated war and peace. This was the place he always returned to, in hours of victory and of defeat, in good times and in bad. He gazed off into the distance, his still auburn hair riffling, his jacket pressed against his body, his eyes scanning the horizon. The winds were so strong that the Secret Service agents around the president could barely stand, but there Bush sat serenely. Gene Becker struggled through the winds to his side. "President Bush, what are you doing, sir?" He looked at her with a puzzled expression, as if the answer were obvious. "I can't see anything from the house," he replied, just audible over the whooshing weather, "and I don't want to miss anything."
Destiny and Power, the American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. Jon Meacham, my friend. Great job, Bush. Thank you.
Thank you.
The podium.
I could just yell loudly, which I'll do. John, thanks so much for being here with us, for sharing this wonderful work, which I'm sure we'll all enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd please remain in your seats, or at least in your seated area, while the President and Mrs. Bush depart. Once they have departed, we'll go out to the lobby for refreshments and some book signing. We need to work him out a little bit. Thank you guys for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, President and Mrs. George Bush. Thank you all so much for being here. You just kind of hang for a couple of minutes and we'll say goodbye.